Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deke's Techniques. Remember the custom grumpy bird that we created last week? Well, this week we're going to give him a background. Now, this is a pretty ambitious project, but it's a lot of fun. We're going to start things off with these simple objects, just 3 ellipses and this tall rectangle, and we're going to transform them into this radiant, cheerful cartoon background that features these rays of light at the top as well as a couple of flowers and a shadow to go behind the bird in order to create this final version of the artwork inside Adobe Illustrator. Here, let me show you exactly how it works. All right, here's the final version of that bird background, just so you can see what a stunner it is on screen. We're going to start off inside of this document, and if you're working along with me, the first thing I want you to do is turn off all the layers except for the back layer. And the easiest way to do that is to just drag along this column of eyeballs from bacon up to face. And then go ahead and click on the back layer to make it active. And now I'm going to press Control minus or Command minus on the Mac in order to zoom out so that we can see the background from a distance. That gives us some room to work. We're going to start things off with the grass here. So I'll go ahead and click on that green grass rectangle. Just a rectangle that's the same width as the artboard and 100 points tall. And it's filled with a solid shade of green. Then I'll go up to the window menu and choose the appearance command to bring up the appearance panel. And the first thing we need to do here is lay down the various stratas of the grass, because you can see in the final version of the artwork that we have green grass progressing toward a sort of chartreuse at the top. And we're going to lay those shades of grass down as independent fills, all assigned to the same path. With the path selected, go ahead and drop down to the Add New Fill icon in the lower left corner of the appearance panel. And now grab that new fill, which is appearing at the top of the stack, and drag it down to the bottom of the stack like so. And you can go ahead and twirl close the top fill and the stroke if you like, because we're not going to be using those. We are, however, going to be using this fill right there. So click on that bottom fill to make it active. And then click on the color swatch. And notice inside of this document, I've gone ahead and included some swatches inside of this group called grass colors. I'll go ahead and hover over them so those of you who don't have the sample document can see them. This next shade of green is R150, G200, and B0, in case you feel the need to dial that in. I'll go ahead and select that color. That doesn't change the appearance of the rectangle on screen because this fill is in the background. To make the fill larger, which is what we want to do, go ahead and make sure it's active, so click on it, and then go up to the Effect menu, choose Distort and Transform, and then choose the Transform command. Tab down to the vertical option and change it to 120%. If you turn on the preview checkbox, you can see that makes the fill taller in both directions. We just want to raise it upward, so go ahead and select that bottom point in the reference point matrix right there. It's located on the right side of the dialog box in Illustrator CS5 and earlier, and then click OK. Now let's make a duplicate of that fill, and you can see if you twirl the fill open, you should see a transform effect assigned to it. You can make a duplicate of the fill by clicking on it in order to make sure it's selected, and then click on the little page icon at the bottom of the appearance panel, and that'll create a duplicate like so. Go ahead and twirl close the top one for now, and twirl open the bottom one. Click on its color swatch, and this time we're going to change it to the next swatch in the list here, inside the same group, which is R160, G220, and B60. So those are, by the way, the red, green, blue values. Go ahead and select that guy, and then click off the panel to hide it, and click on the word Transform to bring up the Transform Effect dialog box, and just change that vertical value to 140%, turn on the Preview checkbox, and you can see that raises it incrementally, and then click OK. Now we need to make another duplicate, so click on the fill item to select it. Click on a little page icon at the bottom of the panel to make a copy of it. Twirl close that top fill, click on the bottom one, change its color this time to this final swatch, which is R210, G240, B50, and that'll go ahead and assign that chartreuse color. And then click on the word Transform, change the vertical value, not surprisingly to 160 this time. I just keep increasing this value by 20%. Turn on the Preview checkbox and you'll see that comparatively yellow fill rise up in the background. Then click OK. Now here's where things get interesting. What I want is to create these rolling hills. So I'll switch back to the final version of the illustration. I want to raise up the grassy knoll here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, and I want it to dip down in the center, and I want it to appear rounded as well. So you might think, if you have any experience in Illustrator, that the way to go is to apply a warp effect, and that is where we'll be starting, but there's no warp that really gives us that effect by itself. So I'm going to switch over to my illustration in progress once again here. Twirl close that fill for now, and click on the word path in order to make sure it's selected so that we're applying the warp effect not to any single fill, but to the entire path outline. And then go up to the effect menu, choose warp, and choose arc upper, which comes the closest to giving us what we're looking for. And you're just going to have to suspend belief for now because it's not going to look right at all in just a moment, but choose the command. And now I'm going to change the bend value to -90 degrees. Make sure that the horizontal radio button is selected, and then tab your way down to the vertical distortion option and change it to 50%. And then turn on the preview checkbox, and you can see we end up getting this effect here. We're getting these mountain shapes because of the vertical distortion, and we're getting this bend in the center here because the arc upper style is set to such a ferociously negative bend value. Now go ahead and click OK in order to accept that effect. Obviously, this is way too spiky for what we're trying to accomplish, so we need to round off the effect, and you can do that by assigning a round corners effect. So go up to the effect menu, choose stylize, and choose round corners. I found that a radius of 300 points ended up working best. Again, you have to suspend belief at this point. I had to play around with these settings a lot in order to figure this out, because if you turn on the preview checkbox, it's going to look totally wrong. But this is the value we want. So go ahead and click OK in order to accept that change. So here's the problem so far. We've assigned the effects in the wrong order. What needs to happen is round corners needs to come first, and then warp arc upper. And even though everything else in Illustrator works from the bottom on up, that is, this bottommost fill is actually at the bottom of the stack, where effects are concerned, the first effect is at the top, and the second effect is at the bottom, and so forth. So here's the easiest way to solve the problem. Go ahead and drag warp arc upper all the way to the bottom of the stack, under the fill. And do the same with round corners. Go ahead and drag it down just below the fill and above the warp effect. Now, that's not going to immediately change the appearance of the rectangle that is dragging round corners into a different location, but it will matter in just a moment. Now, the next thing I wanted to do is to inflate the size of this knoll, and I'll do that using a transform effect by going up to the effect menu, choosing distort and transform, and choosing transform once again. Go ahead and select that bottom point in the reference point matrix and increase the horizontal value to 150%. And then take the vertical scale value up to 154. Then turn on the preview checkbox, and you'll see this effect here. Now, things are still messed up, and we have a bit of a gap down here at the bottom. So to get rid of that gap, change the vertical move value to 10 points like so, and then go ahead and click OK in order to apply that effect. And now, just to make sure everything reconciles the way it needs to, drag that transform effect between round corners and warp effect in order to fill things out ever so slightly. And even though that didn't make the biggest difference, it will by the time we're done. Now, at this point, it dawned on me, this knoll isn't nearly tall enough, and the only way to really fix that problem that I found was to adjust the position values associated with each one of the incremental fills. So I'll go ahead and start with this last fill here, the yellowish one. Twirl it open, and then click on Transform in order to bring up its transform effect. You might figure you could just go ahead and change the vertical scale value, but that doesn't really give us the appearance we want. I'll go ahead and turn on the preview checkbox, and let's say I change that value to 250% to take it up, and that reduces the roundness of things, which is not what I want. So I'll go ahead and reset that value to 160%, and instead, I'll change the vertical move value to -50 points, which actually moves the fill upward, as you can see. And it changes the shape of the entire knoll because it's the topmost fill. That's the effect I'm looking for, so now I'll go ahead and click OK. And now we just need to adjust the fills in between. I'll twirl this guy closed, twirl the next one open like so, click on the word transform in order to bring up the transform panel, change the vertical move value, this time to -38 points, and then turn on the preview checkbox. And so negative vertical move values move things upward, positive values move them downward. Now I'll click OK in order to accept that effect. Twirl this guy closed, twirl this next one open, click on its transform, and change the vertical move value for the final time to -22 points, and then turn on the preview checkbox to see our newest effect. Click OK in order to accept that change. That finishes off the grass, so I'll go ahead and zoom in on my illustration. Now let's add the rays of light, but before we do, switch over to the Layers panel and twirl open the back layer. And you can see I have a couple of other items that I've created in the background. If you turn off that null for the moment, which is just called path, it's this guy right there, turn it off. And then turn on this compound shape down here at the bottom, you can see that I've created a collection of clouds. And all they are, by the way, is a bunch of ellipses with this polygonal path outline drawn in the background just to fill things out. And then I just went ahead and combined them all into a single compound shape from the Pathfinder panel. We saw that in previous movies, but you Alt-click or you Option-click on the Unite icon. I'll press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac to deselect those clouds. And the same holds true, by the way, for these trees right here. They're just a bunch of ellipses with a rectangle at the bottom. These little guys down here are independent flower shapes that we'll come to in a moment. But I just want you to see what's going on. I'll turn the null back on here, this shape near the top. And the next thing we want to do is add some rays of light in the background. We're going to do that by clicking on this rectangle right there. And I'll press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac just so that we can see the entire thing. It's this vertical bluish rectangle. And we're going to spread it out to create a couple of rays as follows. You start off by switching back to the Appearance panel, just so we can see the effects build up. Then go up to the Effect menu, choose Distort Transform, and choose the Transform command. And what we need to do here is to create a couple of rectangles on either side of this one. So change the horizontal move value to 200 points, and then turn on the Preview checkbox, and you can see that just moves it over to the side. What we need to do is create one copy, and that way we have two versions of this rectangle in different locations. Now click OK. And because we want the other copy of the rectangle to be symmetrical, we might as well just take this guy and make a copy of him. So click on Transform here in the Appearance panel, and then click on the little page icon at the bottom of the panel in order to create a duplicate of it. Click on that second transform. Change the horizontal value this time to negative 200 points. Turn on the Preview checkbox, and you can see we get another one to the left-hand side because Copies is already set to 1. Now go ahead and click OK. Next, what we want to do, turn these rectangles into rays that are going out in different directions, and that means applying a vertical distortion, which you can apply using any one of the warp effects. Doesn't matter which one you apply. So go up to the Effect menu, choose Warp, and then choose anything. Really doesn't matter. I'll just go ahead and choose Arc since it's the first command. Turn on the Preview checkbox, and you can see this is not the effect we want at all. This is the last effect we applied. Regardless of what style you're using, you want to change the bend value to 0%. Then you want to tab your way down to the vertical value and change it to negative 100, which is as low as you can go, and you'll end up with this effect here, which is wrong, but we're going to take care of that in just a moment. The problem is that instead of all the rays bending outward, they're bending independently, and that's because the warp got positioned in the wrong location. Illustrator does this sometimes. It doesn't always apply effects sequentially. So what you need to do is grab that warp effect and drag it to the bottom of the stack in order to create this effect here. And you can see that these rays are now bending dramatically outward. That's too much, so we need to once again transform the shapes by going up to the Effect menu, choosing Distort and Transform, and choosing Transform. Most likely, Illustrator will ask you if you really want to apply a new effect, since we already have two transforms at work here, but we do. So go ahead and click on the Apply New Effect button, and then change the horizontal scale value to 45%. That's all we need. And then turn on the Preview checkbox, and you can see that ends up tidying things up nicely. Now click OK. The final thing to do is to click on the word Opacity down here at the bottom of the stack. Change the blend mode from normal to overlay, so we end up getting a little bit of interaction up here at the top of the gradient, and then change the opacity value to 50% in order to create this effect here. Now I'll press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac to zoom in, and I'll press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac in order to deselect my artwork. Now the final thing we want to do is create these little flowers right here, and you may figure the best way to do that is to draw a star shape and then somehow make it bulbous. But the easier way to approach these kinds of shapes is to draw a single ellipse and then transform it. So you'd rotate it a total of 6 times in this case. Let me show you what that looks like. I'll go ahead and select this right-hand ellipse for starters here. And then I'll go up to the Effect menu, and this time might as well just choose that second transform command there, the one with the ... dots, so that we can easily access the command. And you want to change both the scale values back to 100%. You want the move values to be 0 apiece. Go ahead and select the bottom point in the reference point matrix. Change the rotate value to 60 degrees. Now turn on the preview checkbox, and you can see that goes ahead and rotates the ellipse to the left there. Now click in the copies option and press the up arrow key until you fill out the flowers, which happens at a value of 5. Now click OK. Now I want the flower to appear at a kind of jaunty angle. So I'll return to the effect menu, choose transform again. Illustrator's going to grump at me. I'll just go ahead and click on apply new effect. I'll change the rotate value this time to negative 15 degrees. I'll change the vertical scale value to 90%. You want to go ahead and click inside the center point of the reference point matrix. Change the number of copies to 0, and then turn on the preview checkbox, and you end up with this effect here. Now click OK. Now we want to turn the other ellipse into a flower as well, and it'd be nice if I could just go ahead and copy the effects I've already assigned to this flower over to this guy, which I can. And you do that from the Layers panel. So switch back to the Layers panel. Go ahead and scroll down the list here inside the back layer. And notice that the selected path, the one over here on the left, is just called path. It appears at the top of the stack. And the other one, this guy right here, is the next path down. Notice it has a kind of volumetric meatball, which means it has dynamic effects assigned to it. And you want to go ahead and copy those effects over to this one. And you do that by pressing the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and dragging from this location to here and then releasing. And notice that goes ahead and copies all those effects over. Now switch back to the Appearance panel. And the great thing is the first transform effect is exactly right, because the 6-petal flower is going to be the same regardless of its angle. So all we need to do is change the second transform by clicking on it. And now I'll change the vertical scale value this time to 80%. And I'll change the rotate value to 30 degrees. And if you turn on the preview checkbox, you'll see that we end up getting a kind of skewed flower this time around. And now click OK. Switch back to the Layers panel, assuming you're working along with me, and go ahead and turn on all those layers once again, except for the top text layer. The last thing we need to do is establish this ellipse right here is a shadow under the bird. Currently, it's too dark, and because it's filled with black, all we need to do is change its opacity value. We don't have to change the blend mode to multiply. So just go ahead and change the opacity value to 50% up here in the center of the control panel. And I'll press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac in order to deselect the artwork. And that, friends, is a long but comprehensive look at how you create a dramatic cartoon background here inside Illustrator. If you're a member of the lynda.com online training library, I have a follow-up movie in which I show you how to stroke live editable text inside of Illustrator. And notice that the black stroke appears in back of the white letters to create this final version of the artwork. I know, it seems like it'd be an obvious operation, but it's not. If you're waiting for next week's free movie, I'll show you how to take this generic wood photograph and we'll dress it up with some synthetic water droplets created entirely from scratch inside Photoshop. Deeks techniques each and every week. You don't want to make me angry, bud. So keep watching. In this movie, we'll take these two text objects, that is to say the one on the left and the one over here on the right, and we'll stroke the text, which is not an intuitive operation inside of Illustrator, but it can be accomplished, whether you're working with live editable text or with text that's been converted to path outlines, as in our case. I'll go ahead and switch over to the final version of the illustration that we created in the previous movie. And if you're working along with me, go to the Layers panel and turn on the text layer. And you can see that we have two text objects. Now, as I say, I have converted them to path outlines, as you can see. But what I'm about to show you works with live editable text as well. The only reason I haven't given you live editable text is because you might not have these fonts. And just so you know what these fonts are, the one over here on the left is called Feast of Flesh. You can look it up online and download it for free. The font over here on the right is Reporter, which is a commercial font from Adobe. Just so you know. Anyway, I'm going to twirl open my text layer, and I'll turn off that fonts object, just so we can focus on the text itself. Then what you want to do is click on this text here, over here on the left-hand side, with the black arrow tool to select it. This would work with live editable text as well. And here's the steps you want to take. When you're working with path outlines, you want to press Control-H or Command-H on the Mac just to hide them so you can better see what you're doing. Then switch over to the Appearance panel, which you can get by going up to the Window menu and choosing the Appearance command. And just to keep things as tidy as possible, you want to get rid of the fill that's currently associated with this object. And you do that by going up to the first swatch up here in the Control panel and changing it to None. And that'll make the text disappear. That's okay. Now you go back over to the Appearance panel and you click on the word Group to make sure it's selected. If you were working with a type object, you click on the word Type instead. Then you want to drop down to the Add New Stroke icon in the bottom left corner of the Appearance panel and click on it. And that's going to give you both a stroke and a fill, as you see here. I'm going to go ahead and click on the word Fill and change it to white. And then I'll click on a stroke, and let's make sure that it's set to a nice rich black by clicking on the black swatch. And then change the line weight value to 5 points in order to thicken up that stroke. Now, obviously, that's totally wrong. So what we need to do to get rid of those jagged transitions right there is click on the word stroke and then set the corner to round join in order to get rid of those spikes. That's still not the effect I'm looking for. What we want is the stroke behind the fill. And all you need to do to accomplish that is drag the stroke down below the fill and drop it into place, and you end up getting this effect here. Now I'll go and zoom out by pressing Control-0, Command-0 on the Mac. I want to go ahead and duplicate those same settings over onto Abilities here. So I'll press the V key to confirm that I've got the black arrow tool, and then I'll click on this text in order to select it. I'm not seeing the path outlines because they're hidden, but if I were to press Control-H or Command-H on the Mac, you can see that the text is selected. I'll go ahead and press Control-H or Command-H again in order to hide those edges so I can better see what I'm doing. And now I'll switch back to the Layers panel, and I'll take advantage of that same trick that we saw in the previous movie. Notice that the meatball is filled in and sort of sculptural for the first text object. That is the text in the upper left corner of the document. So I'll go ahead and press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and drag from that meatball onto this one here in order to transfer all of those effects. So the lack of fill associated with the actual path outlines in this case, and the fill and stroke attributes that are assigned with the entire group, or again, if you were working with a type object, the overall type object itself. I don't want a white fill and a black stroke. I want the opposite. So I'll just go ahead and press Shift-X in order to swap those attributes like so. And then I'll return to the Appearance panel. I'll click on the stroke, and I'll change its line weight this time to 3 points. And that is all there is to it. What you want to do now is press Control-H or Command-H on the Mac in order to bring back your selection edges, because whether you see the selection edges or not is a saved attribute of the document. So you always want to turn them back on when you're done. And then press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac in order to center my zoom. And I'll press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac in order to deselect the text. And that, folks, is how you stroke text in Illustrator, whether it's expressed as live editable text or, as in our case, text that's been converted to path outlines. Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deke's Techniques. This week, I'll show you how to create synthetic water droplets inside Photoshop. So the wood grain in the background, that's an actual photograph, but the droplets themselves are 100% fabricated. I'm going to start off in this movie by showing you how to create the drops. Now you might look at this and say, well, these don't look much like drops. They will. And you can imagine that this kind of pattern might adapt itself to all kinds of different situations. You could create spots or contour lines, what have you. Every time you follow these steps, you're going to get different results, and there's no drawing involved. It's all a combination of 3 filters and 2 adjustment layers. Here, let me show you exactly how it works. Here's the final water drop effect, just so you can see it on screen. We're going to start off inside of this image. It comes to us from the Fotolia image library, about which you can learn more at fotolia.com/Deke. But really, any texture background is going to work. First thing you want to do is make the image a little bigger than it currently is, just so you have some additional room to work. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this image to a layer by double-clicking on background here inside the layers panel. And I'll just call this guy wood and then click OK. And now we want to make the image bigger. I'll go ahead and zoom out so that we can see what I'm talking about. I'll go up to the image menu and choose the canvas size command. I'm working in pixels, as you can see here. I've got the relative checkbox turned on, and I'm going to change the width value to 100, and then I'll tab to the height value and change it to 100 as well. And that'll expand the canvas 100 pixels in each direction. That is 50 pixels up, 50 pixels down, and so forth. Now I'll click OK. And you can see that extra room represented by the transparency grid in the background. Next, what you want to do is create a new layer by pressing Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac. And I'll call this layer grayness because that's what it's going to be. And then you click OK. And now we want to fill this layer with gray by going up to the Edit menu and choosing the Fill command. And change Hues to 50% gray, very important. And then the blending options ought to be set to their defaults, that is, a mode of normal, opacity 100%. Preserve transparency needs to be turned off or else we won't actually be able to do anything. Then click OK in order to create that field of gray. Now we want to apply a couple of filters. Might as well apply them as smart filters. So make sure the grayness layer is selected here inside the Layers panel. Then go to the panel's flyout menu and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now go up to the Filter menu, choose Noise, and choose Add Noise. And for this effect, you want to crank the amount value up to 50%. Distribution should be set to uniform, and then you want the monochromatic checkbox to be on. Then click OK. The next step is to go back to the Filter menu, choose Blur, and choose Gaussian Blur. For this effect, I'm going to crank the radius value up to 28 pixels. I'll show you that you can vary this value in just a moment, but for now, 28 pixels, I'll click OK. Now, we're going to need room inside of our Layers panel, so I don't need this empty filter mask. So I'll just go ahead and right-click on it and choose Delete Filter Mask in order to get rid of it. So the last thing this looks like at this point is water drops, but we're going to change that by pressing the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac. And then you want to click on this black-white circle at the bottom of the Layers panel and choose the Threshold command. And because you have Alt or Option down, you'll see the New Layer dialog box. Go ahead and call this guy Drop Maker, and then turn on this checkbox, Use Previous Layer to create clipping mask, and click OK. And then you want to change the threshold value here inside the Properties panel. This would be the Adjustments panel inside previous editions of Photoshop. Go ahead and raise it to 129 in order to produce this effect here. Now, your drops may look different than mine because we're applying a random effect. That is to say, Add Noise applies a random effect. And now I'll go ahead and hide the Properties panel. Now here's what I was talking about with Gaussian Blur. You can change that value by double-clicking on it in order to bring up the Gaussian Blur dialog box. And now notice if you dial in some other value, like I'll dial in 12, you're going to end up with smaller water droplets. So whatever radius value you dial in here will determine the size of the drops. I might take this up to 36 and I get big, huge drops like you see. Anyway, I'm going to cancel out because 28 is what I was looking for. Problem at this point, I'll go ahead and zoom in, is that we have these jagged transitions. We need to soften them up, and here's how you do that. Go ahead and click on that Drop Maker layer to make it active. The only way to pull this one off is with a keyboard shortcut, Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E on the Mac. And that goes ahead and copies everything that you're seeing on screen to a new layer. Then go ahead and rename this layer Blur, because in just a moment, it will be blurry. To make it so, go up to the Filter menu and choose Blur, and then choose Gaussian Blur once again. And this time, we're looking for a radius value of 6 pixels. That tends to work out best. And then click OK. And now that we've softened things up dramatically, we need to reinstate some firm edges. And you do that using a Levels adjustment layer. So press and hold the Alt key once again, or the Option key on the Mac. Click the black-white circle at the bottom of the Layers panel and choose Levels. This time around, you want to call this guy Sharper because that's the purpose he's going to serve. And turn on this checkbox once again, and then click OK. And now, here inside this panel, change the first input levels value to 120, and then tab your way over to the final levels value, so press the tab key twice, and change that white point to 145. So 120 at the beginning, 145 at the end. You want to leave your gamma value set to 1.0, and you'll end up with this effect here. Now go ahead and hide the panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out, and we want to load what we're seeing here as a selection. That is to say, we're going to select all the stuff that's white and deselect the black stuff, and you do that by switching over to the Channels panel, and then press the Control key or the Command key on the Mac, and click on RGB. Now return to the Layers panel. Go ahead and gather up these layers here, sharper through grayness. So click on one layer, shift-click on the other to select that entire range. Let's group them together by going up to the Layers panel flyout menu and choosing New Group from Layers. And I'll go ahead and name this guy Intermediate because these were the intermediate steps. And then I'll click OK. And now you can turn that group off. We're done with it. Now we want to reverse the selection because we want to select the stuff that was black. And you do that by going up to the Select menu and choosing the Inverse command. Then we want to create a new layer by pressing Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac. And we'll call this guy Drops. And then click OK. And now tap the D key to make sure you've got your default colors. Black is the foreground, white is the background. And then press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete on the Mac to fill the selection with black. And then press Control-D or Command-D on the Mac in order to deselect the image. Up here in the Styles panel, I've loaded up some styles in advance here. And if you have access to the exercise files that are included along with this course, then you can load them up as well by going to the Styles panel flyout menu and choosing Load Styles. And then navigate your way to this folder and click on fluidstyles.asl and click on the Load button. But I've already done that in advance. And now I'll go ahead and apply one of these styles, the first one, which is called Clear, which creates a kind of clear liquid effect as you're seeing here. And it's a combination of various layer effects working together. You can check out some of the other ones too. We've got lemonade right here. We've got orange soda, which creates a very orange effect indeed. It's pretty over the top. We've got black ink, if you want to check that out. We have radiator coolant, which creates a kind of blue liquid effect. This guy right there is Bordeaux, as if we've spilled some wine on the wood. We've also got Manhattan, the whiskey drink, that is to say. And then finally, we've got this one called Crimson, which creates this ghoulish effect here. But the one I'm looking for is this guy right there. And that, friends, is how you create water droplets absolutely from scratch here inside Photoshop. If you're a member of the lynda.com online training library, then I have a total of 2 follow-up movies ready and waiting for you. In the first one, we take these black blobs that constitute the water, and we add a series of layer effects in order to create these high-contrast reflections. Next, notice how the wood grain moves directly through the water droplets. It really ought to refract, that is, distort around the droplets, as in this case here. And that is something that I'll show you how to do. If you're waiting for next week's free movie, I'll show you how to take these harmless paint splatters and turn them into something messy like ink or something more sinister like blood. Deeks Techniques, each and every week. Keep watching. In this movie, I'll show you how to establish the various layer effects in order to achieve this reflecting liquid here inside Photoshop. So I'm going to start things off here by selecting this drops layer. And then if you're working along with me, you want to right click on the FX icon and choose Clear Layer Style so that we can start things over here. Step number 1 is to reduce the fill opacity value to 5. And that's going to make the layer darn near invisible, but it's just what we need to be able to build up these effects. Next, drop down to the FX icon and choose Bevel and Emboss. You want to make sure that the style is set to inner bevel. I'm going to take the depth value up to 120%. Direction should be up. And then the size value is going to depend on the size of your image. But in the case of this one, I want a size of 15 pixels like so. Now, my angle and altitude values are set to 135 and 65 degrees respectively. That's what we want for this effect. Then you want to drop down to the highlight mode. Make sure the color is set to white, which it is in my case. And then I'm going to change the blend mode from screen to linear dodge so that we get a hotter effect, as you're seeing here. An opacity value of 75% is just fine. Next, you want to click on the color for the shadow mode. And this is going to depend on how much you want to match your image. But I went ahead and dialed in a hue value of 45 degrees and saturation and brightness values of 35% apiece in order to come up with this kind of dim yellowish brown. Then I'll click OK. Now you want to change the shadow mode from multiply to linear burn so that you end up with a harsher shadow effect as we're seeing here. And you probably want to take the opacity value down. I took it quite a bit down to 15% because after all, we're not going to have a very pronounced shadow where water is concerned. Next, you want to change the gloss contour. And you start things off by clicking the down pointing arrowhead and selecting one of the contours that ships with Photoshop, which is ring. And you end up with this effect here, which is almost what I'm looking for, but not quite. So to modify it ever so slightly, click inside the little contour icon there to bring up the contour editor dialog box. And you want to select this point right there, the one in the upper right corner, and just go ahead and press the left arrow key a few times in order to nudge that point over to the left until the input value is 96%. We still want the output to be 100%, and you end up with this effect here. Then go ahead and click OK in order to accept that change. Now we need a few more shadows. So I'm going to click on Drop Shadow to make it active. It's at the bottom of the list here in CS6. It's at the top of the list in previous versions. Click on the color and change it to that same color, whatever it was that you dialed in a moment ago. In my case, 45, 35, 35. And then click OK to accept that color. By default, the blend mode is set to multiply and the opacity is 75%, which works out beautifully. The only change I'm going to make is to take the size value up to 10 pixels, like so. And we end up with this effect here. Now let's add an inner shadow. So just go ahead and click on inner shadow to turn it on and to access its settings. Click on a color swatch, dial in that same color again, 45, 35, 35 in my case. Then click OK. And this time, we once again want the blend mode to be set to multiply, but we want the opacity value to be a lot lower. So I'm going to reduce it to 35%. The angle value is just fine. I'm going to take the distance value up to 10 pixels, and I'll take the size up to 15 pixels. Finally, we need to add a little bit of color to the liquid. So click on Color Overlay to make it active. I don't want it to be red, so I'm going to click on a color swatch. And the color I came up with, that looked good to me anyway, is a hue value of 210 degrees, a saturation of 50%, and a brightness value of 100%. Then click OK. Next, change the blend mode from normal to linear light, which is going to create this over-the-top blue effect here, and then take the opacity value down to a mere 5%. And that's it. Now click OK in order to accept that effect. There's one additional adjustment that you might want to make. It's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in past the 100% view size. So we're seeing the effect at 200%. And notice how the reflections are coming off as a little harsh. If it's a little bit too jagged for your taste, then what you do is you double click on Bevel and Emboss in order to bring back the settings, and you turn on this checkbox right there, Anti-Alias. And I'll go ahead and move that over so we can see what happens on screen. And you can see that that softens the edges ever so slightly, and it moves the effect over just a little bit as well. Now I'll click OK in order to accept that very subtle change. And now I'll zoom back out so we can take in the entire effect. And that's how you create the appearance of natural water reflections using a handful of layer effects here inside Photoshop. In the next movie, I'll show you how to refract the wood grain in the background so it appears as if it's being magnified by the water. In this movie, I'll show you how to create this refraction effect so that the wood grain appears to be distorted by the water droplets. We'll be doing so by designing a custom displacement map. We'll go ahead and switch over to the image as it appeared at the end of the previous movie. And the first thing we need to do is crop the image. I'll go ahead and scroll upward so you can see why we needed that extra 100 pixels worth of canvas. Because right here at the top of the image, and on all the sides as well, we can see the edges associated with the layer effects. So at this point, we want to go ahead and hide them. And you do that using that same command. So you go up to the image menu and you choose the canvas size command. And then make sure you're working in pixels and that the relative checkbox is turned on. And change both the width and height values to -100 pixels, like so. And then click on the OK button. If Photoshop warns you that some clipping may occur, just click Proceed because that's not actually the case. You're not going to lose anything. And you can see that those aberrant layer effects now go away because they're hidden outside the canvas area. Next thing we want to do is build our displacement map. And you do that by control clicking or command clicking on the thumbnail for the drops layer to load it as a selection. Then go up to the select menu and choose the save selection command. And you want to change the document to new so that you're saving the selection to a new image file, and then click OK. You'll end up seeing this new image file here. Now at this point, if you take a look at the channels panel, you'll see that we've got a single alpha channel. If you want to make this image a little more flexible, go up to the image menu, choose mode, and choose grayscale. And that will change the name of the channel to gray, and we now have a black and white image. Where displacement map is concerned, white is going to displace in one direction and black is going to displace in another direction. We only want to displace the white stuff, so we need to make the black stuff gray. Also, we want to make sure that we're displacing well within the drops and that we have some softness associated with the displacement map as well. So the first thing we want to do is grow the black areas. And you do that by going up to the filter menu, choosing other, and choosing minimum. Minimum goes ahead and expands the size of the minimum luminance level, which is black. In our case, you want to change the radius value to 6 pixels. Ends up working out quite nicely. And then click OK. And that way, all the white pixels, which will ultimately be responsible for the refraction, are scooted in so that they're well inside the water drops. Now you want to soften the transitions by going up to the filter menu, choosing blur and choosing Gaussian blur. And you want to set this radius value to about twice, almost twice as much as you had for the minimum value. And in my case, I found that a radius value of 10 pixels worked out nicely. Then click OK. Finally, you want to make the black pixels gray by going up to the image menu, choosing adjustments, and choosing the levels command, or you can just press Control L or Command L on a Mac. And change this first output levels value to 128. And that'll make all the black stuff gray, and it'll leave the white stuff nice and white. Now click OK. Now you want to save this guy off as a displacement map. So go up to the File menu and choose the Save As command. And I'll go ahead and call this guy something like New Displacement Map. But I have one for you if you want to use it. This one that's called liquiddisplace.psd right there. But in any case, you can go ahead and save off your own. And make sure that the file format is PSD. It has to be. You can't use any other file format for this. And then go ahead and click on the Save button in order to save out that displacement map. Now switch back to your file in progress here. Switch back to the Layers panel. Press Control-D or Command-D on a Mac to deselect the image. Click on the wood layer to make it active. And let's go ahead and turn this guy into a smart object by bringing up the Layers panel flyout menu and choosing Convert to Smart Object. And then what you want to do is go up to the filter menu, choose Distort, and choose Displace. And I came up with these values here. You don't want the horizontal scale value to be anything, so it should be 0. The vertical scale value you can adjust to suit the image at hand. In the case of this image, a value of 4 works very nicely. And then you can just leave the other options set to their defaults. Then click OK. And now you want to go ahead and find that file you just saved. In my case, it's called New Displacement Map. And then click Open in order to apply that displacement map. And now you can see how it's distorting the wood. One problem, though, I'll go ahead and zoom in here to 100%. You can see how the wood is starting to distort before it gets inside of the water. And, of course, that's not right. We want to create a filter mask, but we don't want the existing filter mask that's just going to get in our way. So right-click on that white filter mask right there and choose Delete Filter Mask. And then Control-click or Command-click on the drops layer to reload that selection there. And now, right-click on the word Smart Filter and choose Add Filter Mask. And that will go ahead and mask away the distortion outside of the water droplets. So you're only distorting the wood inside the liquid. And that's all there is to it. You've now managed to create a refraction effect using a custom displacement map here inside Photoshop. Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deke's Techniques. This week, we'll take 3 photographs of paint splatters and we'll transform the nature of the fluid. First to these troubling pools of hemoglobins, which I think come off as shockingly realistic, which is why I thought we'd end things by changing the splatters to harmless ink, which is still terrifying because it's hard to get this stuff out. But if you get scared, just remember, it's not real, it's Photoshop. Here, let me show you exactly how it works. All right, here's a final version of that effect on screen. It's a little bit gruesome, but I think it's credible. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to this image, which contains not only this wood pattern in the background, but 3 different paint splatters, as you can see. And all of these images, by the way, come to us from the Fotolia image library, about which you can learn more at fotolia.com/deek. So I just copied and pasted these images and then moved them around. Now at this point, we need to convert all these images into selections. And the easiest way to select the paint splatters is from the Channels panel. But notice if I switch over to the Channels panel here, that because the paint splatters are all different colors, they show up differently inside the various channels. So for example, in the red channel, the blue paint looks very dark, the green paint looks somewhat dark. In the green channel, the orange paint grows darker, and the blue lightens up just ever so slightly. And then in the blue channel, both the green and the orange paint splatters are very dark indeed. We need to approach these paint splatters in 2 passes, and here's how. I'm going to switch back to the RGB image. Then switch back to the Layers panel. With the wood layer active, you want to make a new layer by pressing Ctrl-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac, and we'll go ahead and call this layer white. And then tap the D key to ensure that you have your default colors, and press Control-Backspace or Command-Delete on the Mac to fill this layer with white. Now we need to change the blend mode assigned to all 3 of the splatter layers. In Photoshop CS6, you can click on one of the layers, shift-click on another to select that entire range, and then change the blend mode for all 3 layers to multiply. If you're working in an earlier version of Photoshop, then you'll need to apply multiply to each layer independently. Now turn the splatter 3 layer, the blue one, off for a moment, and then switch over to the Channels panel. And notice that the blue channel shows up darkest for these 2 paint splatters. So what you want to do is Control-Click or Command-Click on the blue channel to load it up as a selection so that everything that's white is now selected and everything that's black is deselected. We want the opposite effect. So go up to the Select menu and choose the Inverse command. Then switch back to the RGB image, switch back to the Layers panel, and you can go ahead and turn these 2 layers off right there. And then let's create a new layer by pressing Ctrl-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac. And I'll call this guy Splatters, and then click OK. And we just need to fill in that selection with something. Might as well be black for now. So just go ahead and press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete on the Mac in order to fill in that selection like so. Now go ahead and turn that layer off for a moment. Press Control-D or Command-D on the Mac in order to deselect it. Switch to the Splatter 3 layer. Go ahead and turn it on. And then return to the Channels panel. And notice that we have a very dark splatter here inside the green channel. So go ahead and Control-Click on it or Command-Click on the Mac in order to load it up as a selection. And then go back to the Select menu and choose Inverse so that we're selecting the splatter and not the area around it. Then switch back to the RGB image, switch back to the Layers panel, turn off the Splatter 3 layer, turn the Splatters layer back on, click on it to make it active, and press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete to fill that selection. Now you can click in the image to deselect it. At this point, we no longer need these layers. You can either throw them away or you can put them in a group and hide them, which is what I'm going to do. So I'll click on Splatter 3 and shift-click on white to select that entire range. Then I'll go up to the Layers panel flyout menu and choose New Group from Layers. And I'll go ahead and call this guy Paint Photos and then click OK. And now I'll turn that group off so I can focus my attention on the Splatters layer. I want to fill these splatters with a shade of red. So assuming your color panel is available, go up to the flyout menu and switch to HSB sliders. A hue value of 0 degrees is fine. We want to change the saturation to 100% and then change the brightness to 25%. And then press Shift-Alt-Backspace here on the PC or Shift-Option-Delete on the Mac in order to fill the opaque pixels with red. Now, if you've ever taken a look at blood, you may have noticed that it has varying levels of opacity associated with it. And to mimic that effect, I'm going to start things off by converting this guy to a smart object by going up to the Layers panel flyout menu and choosing Convert to Smart Object. Then what you want to do is Control-Click or Command-Click on this layer thumbnail to load it up as a selection outline. Once again, tap the D key to make sure that black and white are your foreground and background colors respectively. Then go up to the Filter menu, choose Render, and choose Clouds. And that'll go ahead and fill just the selected region with those clouds. thanks to the fact that Photoshop automatically converted the selection to a filter mask. Notice if you were to shift-click on that filter mask to turn it off, then you would be filling up the entire image with clouds, which is not what we want. I'll go ahead and shift-click on the filter mask to turn it back on. And now you want to double-click on that little slider icon to the right of the word clouds and change the blend mode to multiply like so. And now you can see that we have varying levels of darkness at work, which is just what I'm looking for. Now I'll click OK. We don't want that much opacity associated with the effect in general. We do want to be able to see through to the wood. So change the fill value to 50%, like so. Next, click on the FX icon and choose Color Overlay so that we can infuse some more color into this effect. Click on the color swatch, which is red by default. A hue value of 0 degrees is great. A saturation value of 100% is exactly right, but I'm looking for a brightness value of 35%. Then click OK. And now I'm going to change the blend mode to linear light and take the opacity value down to 50%. Next, just to add a little more darkness to this effect here, I'm going to turn on gradient overlay. So you want to click on it to make it active. Then click on the color bar to bring up the gradient editor dialog box. Double click on the black color swatch and dial in these values. A hue of 0 degrees is just fine. We want a saturation of 100% and a brightness value of 25%. Then go ahead and press the Enter key or the Return key on a Mac a couple of times in order to make your way back to the Layer Style dialog box. Change the style from linear to radial. Go ahead and crank the scale value up to its maximum like so, and then change the blend mode to multiply. And then go ahead and take the opacity value down to 75% in order to create this effect here, and then click OK in order to accept that change. Now, you don't have to go with this color scheme. If blood isn't what you're looking for, you could, say, simulate blue ink by double-clicking on this Smart Object thumbnail in order to open the Smart Object. If you see this alert message, just click OK. And now I'm going to dial in some new values. I'm going to change the hue to 210 degrees. I'm going to change the saturation to 100 and the brightness to 50. And then I'll press Shift-Alt-Backspace or Shift-Option-Delete on the Mac in order to fill the splatters with blue. And then I'll go ahead and click on the Close button in order to close the image. And here on the PC, you want to click on the Yes button to save your changes back to the larger composition. On the Mac, you would click on the Save button. And that's going to change the color of our splatters. However, we've got these effects on top of it. So I'm just going to turn off the gradient overlay and then double-click on the color overlay in order to bring it up. And then I'll click on the color swatch to bring up the color picker dialog box. And I'll take the saturation down to 50, and then I'll take the brightness up to 40. And I need to change the hue, of course, to 210 degrees like so. And then click OK a couple of times in order to accept that change. And you end up with this inky effect instead. And then you could choose whether to keep the clouds or not. You can turn them off if you don't want them or turn them on to keep them. Totally up to you. For my part, I think what I'm going to do is double click on the little slider icon there and reduce the opacity of the cloud effect to 50%. So there you have it, your own custom splatter effect that you can change to any color you like here inside Photoshop. Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deke's Techniques. This week, we're going to take a look at how you get rid of a special variety of color distortion that's at work inside every single photograph you capture, and it's known as color fringing. Fringing falls into two broad color ranges, the purples and the greens, which are color complements. That is, they're located on opposite sides of the big color wheel, and you can get rid of this fringing inside of Camera Raw 7 and later. Now, by way of demonstration, I have this unremarkable photograph here that I captured using a Canon 5D Mark III, easily one of the best cameras on the market, 22 megapixels, and yet we've got problems. To demonstrate those problems, I'll go ahead and elevate the exposure and saturation levels, and then I'll zoom in on the lower left corner of the photograph and notice right there, indicated by the P, is the purple fringing, and indicated by the G is the green fringing. In Camera Raw 7 and later, as I say, you can totally get rid of that fringing. Notice that it's gone, and yet the saturation levels are still through the roof, which is why I would then take those saturation levels down, now that I know everything's okay, and back out of the photograph, and we've got this accurate correction right here. Here, Let me show you exactly how it works. All right, so I'm looking at this raw photograph that I converted to Adobe's DNG format. That's not necessary, however. You can perform these steps with any raw photograph as well as a TIFF or a JPEG image. We're currently looking at a very large thumbnail view of the image inside Bridge. I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and then right-click inside the image and choose Open in Camera Raw in order to open that image in Camera Raw 7, which ships along with Photoshop 6. Now, obviously, this image is too murky. We need to brighten it up. I came up with an exposure value here of 1.25. Ended up looking pretty good to me. I cranked the contrast value up, which is oftentimes necessary in ACR 7, to plus 50. And then I went ahead and took the highlights value up to 25. And that's about all this image really needs, except for a little boost to the vibrance. However, I want to be able to see the color fringing for all it's worth. So I'm going to blast both the vibrance and the saturation values up to their maximums, which are 100 apiece. And obviously, I'm not going to leave them there. I just want to be able to see what's going on. Now I'll switch over to the lens correction panel. And you want to make sure you're seeing your profile tab up here. Now, the thing is, if you go ahead and zoom in on this image to check out things like color fringing, for example, and then you turn on Enable Lens Profile Corrections, Camera Raw is going to immediately zoom you back out. So you might as well take care of this correction in the fit-in window view. Something else to note here, this is a very wide-angle image. I shot it with a focal length of 17 millimeters. So you can see there's a big difference between no lens correction and the automatic correction that ACR is applying to this image. And just as shooting extreme wide angles or telephoto shots can distort the photograph, it can distort the colors inside the photograph as well. And to see what distortion is up, you want to switch over to the color tab right here. And I'm going to drag around this area with my zoom tool in order to scroll in on it. And I might want to just go ahead and zoom in a little farther even. And notice this extreme chromatic aberration that's going on here. We've got the green edge on a dark edge of the sign and this purple edge on a light edge as well. And that's in part because the light is getting distorted on its way through the lens as it hits the image sensor. We can take care of a lot of this problem just by turning on this checkbox, Remove Chromatic Aberration, which is also included in Camera Raw 6, which ships along with Photoshop CS5. However, that doesn't totally take care of things. You can see how our colorful edges largely went away, but not entirely. We've still got a purplish edge over here, a lot of aberrant blues, and these aberrant cyans as well. And that's the purpose of these options, which only exist in Camera Raw 7. So we've got two defringe sliders. One's purple amount and one's green amount. And you can think of them as being opposites of each other. Notice you can also control what constitutes purple and what constitutes green using these purple and green hue options. They include colors. And so notice here, on the far left side of purple hue, we've got blue, the exact same shade of blue that appears on the far right side of green hue. Likewise, green hue starts with this shade of orange here that exactly matches the shade of orange at which purple hue ends. So if you were to crank those up all the way, then you'd end up including the entire color spectrum. So what I recommend you do is decide, of course, what colors you're looking at. What are the aberrant colors? In our case, we obviously have purple. So I'll go ahead and take this purple amount value up here until those purples disappear, which happens somewhere around 10. Now I'm going to scroll over to this location here. And we're so far in, I'll just tell you that we're looking at one of the boulders that the guy in the sign is knocking off. And notice that we've got some very pronounced blue edges here. And we can defeat those edges using this purple hue slider. So if I drag this left-hand slider triangle all the way over to the left-hand side, then we get rid of those blues. But notice also, I'm going to zoom in even farther here. Notice we end up creating these white lumpy edges right there. And that's in large part a function of the fact that we have the vibrance and saturation values cranked up so high. But this does give me the opportunity, because those values are so high, to go ahead and back off this setting. So if I were to take it back to 10, for example, I end up getting rid of those weird white edges. Now let's take a look at what's going on with the greens. I'm going to scroll back to that left-hand corner that we were looking at a moment ago to where the greens are showing up there. But notice if I take my green amount value up to 10, not much happens. I'm not really seeing any difference until I go ahead and expand what it means to be green and take that into the blue territory. And you can see as I drag this right-hand slider triangle over to the right, I end up getting rid of those bluish greens. I also, once again, create those white gaps. So you want to avoid that if possible, which is why I'm going to take this value back to about 80 like so. And if you're ever interested in reinstating default values, for purple hue, it's 30 and 70. For green hue, it's 40 and 60. Just FYI. Now then, what we don't want to do, we don't want to expand the purple hues or the green hues into the warm territory. So if I take purple hue into the reds, notice what happens. I've got gaps around my edges like crazy now, and things become even more grim. Notice the background, how very yellowish and green it is. If I expand the green hue over to the left-hand side, then I end up losing a lot of that color, and you end up creating some very jagged transitions as well. So let's go ahead and reinstate those guys to what they were before. This is 70 by default, and this one here is 40 by default, and that's where we want to leave both of those. Now, at this point, we want to go ahead and restore the normal colors by going back to the basic panel here. And I'm going to take the vibrance value down to something like plus 50, which is still pretty darn high, but works well for this image. I'm going to take the saturation value down to 20. By virtue of the fact that I'm zoomed so far in to 200%, I can see that I've got some noise going inside this image. So I'll switch over to the detail panel, and I'll just go ahead and take this luminance noise value up to 25. And that ends up tapering the noise pretty nicely. Just one more change I want to make. I'm going to press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac to zoom all the way out. And if I were to switch back to lens correction and click on Profile again and turn off Enable Lens Profile Corrections, you can see that not only is Camera Raw getting rid of a lot of barrel distortion, but it's also brightening this dark vignette around the corners. I'll go ahead and turn it back on because I want to get rid of that distortion, but I actually want to bring back some of that vignetting because this is such an ominous sign, don't you know? So I'm going to switch over to the effects panel, and I'm going to take this post-crop vignetting value down to -35 like so. And otherwise, I'm going to leave the values set to their defaults, and that's it. Now, presuming that I want to open this image as a smart object inside of Photoshop so that I can come back and modify my settings later, I'll press and hold the Shift key, which changes the Open Image button into an Open Object button in order to open the image inside of Photoshop. And you can see, after the progress bar disappears, that we have a smart object ready and waiting for us here inside the Layers panel. I'll go ahead and press the F key a couple of times in order to switch to the full screen mode. And that, friends, is how you precisely correct for the color fringing associated with chromatic aberrations with the help of Adobe Camera Raw 7. Now that we've corrected the photograph, I think it's high time we had some fun with it. After all, the scenario described by this sign just is not sufficiently dangerous to warn off today's desensitized youth, which is why next week I'll show you how to add a credible image element to a photograph of a danger sign in Photoshop. Specifically, we'll add this cheerful creature right here. At least he's having fun. Deeks Techniques each and every week. Keep watching. Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deeks Techniques. This week, we're going to take a danger sign and make it more dangerous in Photoshop. Specifically, we're going to take this real-life sign that's available to you all at the Cliffs of Moher in Ireland, better known as the Cliffs of Insanity in the movie Princess Bride. But this sign here wouldn't dissuade anybody from going to the edge of the cliff. At least it didn't work for me, but this one would have. And we're going to create this guy as an intricate shape layer inside Photoshop. Here, let me show you exactly how it works. All right, here's that extra scary version of the warning sign. And here's the unmodified version, which is where we'll start. The only changes I've made are to add a few path outlines just to expedite the process. You can, however, of course, draw your own path outlines if you like. So I'm going to start by switching over to the Paths panel, which you can get by choosing the Paths command from the window menu. And then I'll click on the shark body path here. And if I scroll up and press the A key to switch to my black arrow tool, and then click on the path outline. You can see it's very simple. Just a total of 4 anchor points, and that's it. To convert the path to a shape layer, return to the Layers panel, then drop down to this black-white circle at the bottom of the panel, and press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, and go ahead and choose the very top command, Solid Color. Because you have the Alt or Option key down, you'll see the New Layer dialog box. I'm going to go ahead and call this guy Shark, and click OK. By default, Photoshop should just go ahead and select black for you, in which case you can click OK, because we want a black shark. We also want to mask the shark inside of the confines of the sign, which means grabbing this cliff over here on the left-hand side and flipping it over to the right so that we can generate a mask. And we'll do that for starters by turning off the shark layer, and then go ahead and click on the Develop Photo layer there. Press the L key to switch to the lasso tool, and you want to press and hold the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, and click around this cliff like so. And make sure that you leave plenty of white margin around there. But you don't need to select the orange margin outside the sign, and you don't need to select the rocks either. We just need this portion of the cliff selected. All right, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so that I can see what I'm doing a little more up close and personal. And I'll jump a copy of the cliff to a new layer by pressing Control-Alt-J or Command-Option-J on the Mac. And I'll go ahead and call this new layer Cliff and click OK. And you can see that we now have a duplicate of the cliff on an independent layer. Now, go up to the Edit menu, choose Transform, and choose Flip Horizontal in order to flip the cliff to the other side like so. And then you want to press the Control key or the Command key on the Mac in order to temporarily access the Move tool on the fly. And go ahead and drag that cliff over to the right-hand side like so. Now we want to scale the cliff so it's taller than the shark. And normally you would turn the shark layer back on so you could keep track of what you're doing. I already happen to know the settings I'm going to use, however. So I'll turn that shark layer off. And then with the cliff layer active, I'll return to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform, where you can press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac. And we want to scale with respect more or less to the bottom right corner of the bounding box. So I'll select that corner up here in the reference point matrix on the far left side of the options bar. Then I'm going to turn on the link between the width and height values. I'll click on W to select the width value, and I'll change it to 124. And then we need to adjust the X and Y values to get this guy exactly in place. And the values I'm looking for are these. I'll go ahead and click on the X value and change it to 3342, and then tab to the Y value and change it to 2702. So it's just a few pixels off in both directions. And we end up with this effect here, at which point you want to go ahead and press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac a couple of times in order to apply your change. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here. Now we need to convert this cliff to a kind of layer mask for the shark so that he's not exceeding the boundaries of the sign. And we'll do that by switching to the Channels panel, which you can get by choosing the Channels command from the window menu. The cliff appears darkest in the red channel than the other two, so go ahead and grab the red channel and drag it onto the little page icon at the bottom of the Channels panel to make a copy, and we'll call this new channel Mask. Then press Control-I or Command-I on the Mac to invert the channel. Now we need to increase the contrast by going up to the Image menu and choosing Adjustments, and then you want to choose the Levels command. We want to change this first input levels value to 100, so we're darkening up the darkest colors. And then change the last input levels value to 200 in order to produce this effect here. So 100, 1.00, and 200. Then click OK. And now, if you want to clean things up a little bit, which is probably a good idea, we'll go and zoom in here. And I'll press the B key to switch to the brush tool. You want to tap the D key as well, as in default, in order to get the default foreground and background colors. Then right-click inside the image window and increase your hardness value to 100%. Then you can click away some of these little particles that are appearing inside of the cliff, like so. And finally, after painting that junk away, you'll want to increase the size of your brush by pressing the right bracket key a few times, and then click on that screw to get rid of it. Now press the L key to switch back to the lasso tool. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, press and hold the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, and just make sure to select all the way around the cliff. You don't have to select tight to the edge. In fact, you want some black margin in there just to make sure you don't goof things up. And then when you're done, you can release both the mouse button and the Alt or Option key. Go up to the Select menu and choose the Inverse command, or press Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I on a Mac, and then press Control-Backspace or Command-Delete on the Mac to fill everything outside of the marching ants. Now press Control-D or Command-D on the Mac in order to deselect the image. We want to load this mask as a selection, and you do that by Control-clicking on it here on a PC or Command-clicking on it on the Mac. Then switch back to the RGB image. Switch over to the Layers panel. You can turn off the cliff layer for now, turn on the shark layer, click on it, and then drop down to the Add Layer Mask icon and click on it in order to convert the selection outline to a layer mask. Now we need to bring back in the rest of the shark, which you do by copying and pasting paths. So switch over to the Paths panel, and then click on the mouth path. In order to make it active, press the A key to switch to the black arrow tool, and click on the path outline to select it like so. Then press Control-C or Command-C on the Mac in order to copy the mouth. Switch to this path right there, this temporary one that's called Shark Shape Path, which is the path for the shape layer. And then press Control-V or Command-V on the Mac to paste in the mouth. Then you want to go up to this icon, which is called Path Operations, up in the Options bar. Click on it and switch it to Subtract Front Shape in order to subtract away that mouth. Now let's scroll up a little bit here. We want to grab the sweat above the guy's head, and that's this sweat path right there. Go ahead and click on it, marquee the paths like so, and press Control-C or Command-C on the Mac to paste them. Then click in this Sharp Shape path again, and press Control-V or Command-V on the Mac in order to paste them in place. Now it looks like they're set to that Subtract Front mode again, but they're actually not. If I go up here to the Path Operations, we've got Combine Shapes selected, which means that the sweat will be added to the shark. Problem is, it falls outside of the layer mask. So you need to switch back to the Layers panel. Make sure that Layer Mask thumbnail is selected. Press the M key to switch to the rectangular marquee tool. And just select this general area up here. And then, assuming white is your foreground color, press Alt Backspace or Option Delete on the Mac to fill the selection with white and bring back the sweat. Now you can click anywhere inside the image to deselect it, and then switch back to the Paths panel and click on the Teeth path to select them, and then press the A key to switch back to your black arrow tool. Click on the top teeth and shift-click on these bottom ones that are just sitting here loose, and then press Control-C or Command-C on the Mac to copy them, switch back to the Shark Shape path, and then press Control-V or Command-V on the Mac in order to paste those teeth into place. And the reason we have two different groups of teeth, neither of which is quite right, is because I was trying to figure out the better approach as opposed to just sitting there and drawing every single one of them, which got a little bit tedious. So came up with two approaches. You see which one you like. I'm going to click off the paths in order to deselect them. And then I'll click on this top set of teeth to select them. I'm going to create a copy of them by pressing the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and then dragging them to this location here. So you have to have the Alt or Option key down before you start dragging. That way you can make a copy of those teeth at this new location. Then press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac in order to enter the free transform mode. Grab that little target right there, which is the origin point for the transformation. Drag them to the upper left corner like so, and then drag outside the teeth to rotate them into place until they look like this. This is fine. And then press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to apply that change. And now Alt drag or Option drag the teeth again to right about here in order to create another copy of them. And then press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac to enter the free transform mode. Drag that little target up and to the left like so. Then you want to rotate the teeth into place and scale them, by the way. So I'm dragging on this lower right corner handle in order to scale the teeth, and I'm pressing the Shift key as I do so, so I'm scaling the teeth proportionally. Then I might move down to about here. And then press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to apply that change. Now let's say you want to lengthen a few of the teeth. Then what you do is you switch from the Path Selection tool, the black arrow tool, to the Direct Selection tool, the white arrow tool. Now go ahead and marquee those 2 points and shift marquee this one as well. At least that's what I did. And then drag those points down a little bit to make the teeth taller. And I might move this one over a little bit. We might need some further adjustments in the future. Now we got to get these guys right here. And so what you want to do is press Shift-A in order to switch back to the black arrow tool. Click on these teeth to select them and drag them up into the bottom of the mouth, like so. And at this point, I decided I bet I could warp these teeth to match the bottom of the mouth. You once again want to press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac to enter the free transform mode. And then you can click on this little warp icon on the right side of the options bar. And then you choose a warp style. Now, in our case, it's got to be arch so that the teeth remain upright as they bend. They're bending the wrong direction, however, and I ultimately came up with a bend value of -26, as you can see up there in the options bar. Then you want to tab over to the horizontal distortion value and change it to -45%. And then you can press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to apply that warp on the fly. Now we need to scale and rotate the teeth, and you do that by clicking on this warp icon once again, this time to turn it off. And I went ahead and moved this target over to this location on the right side of the teeth. And then I dragged up a little bit until I rotated them about 3 degrees. Works out nicely. I'm going to nudge these guys down too. And then I ended up changing the width value to 98%. So not a lot of scaling going on, but just a little bit. And then I'll press the Enter key, the Return key on the Mac a couple of times in order to apply that change. And I'm going to move these guys out like so. We have too many teeth, as you can see here. I didn't know when I was grading the teeth how many I'd need. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. In order to select the extra teeth and delete them, you want to press Shift-A, once again, this time to switch back to the wide arrow tool, and marquee this region right there. Unfortunately, in addition to selecting the teeth, that selects parts of a couple of other paths. To deselect them, what you got to do is press the Shift and Alt keys, that Shift and Option on the Mac, and click once and then twice on the big shark outline, and then once and then twice on the mouth outline. So just make sure you have the Shift and Alt keys down, that Shift and Option on the Mac in order to make that work. And then press the backspace key or the delete key on the Mac to get rid of the extra teeth. And then this guy needs to be tucked in just a little bit like so. And then finally, so we don't have that line through the middle of things, you want to switch to the pen tool, which you can get by pressing the P key, and drag down and to the right from that farthest left anchor point, and then drag up and to the right from the last one over here on the right-hand side, and you end up with this effect here, which looks great. And now all we got to do, if you want to add a little texture to the shark, then switch back to the Layers panel, grab that cliff layer, drag it above the shark layer, turn it on, and then press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on the horizontal line between cliff and shark to combine them into a clipping mask. Now I'll zoom out a couple of clicks here so that we can take in all of the sign at a time. Now, admittedly, that's not everything. In the next movie, in fact, I'll show you how to heighten the realism of this effect. But that is how you go about turning a scary sign into something much scarier inside Photoshop. If you're a member of the lynda.com online training library, I have a follow-up movie in which I show you how to enhance the credibility of this shark. Now, for example, I wanted to give him an eye, but I didn't want to draw it in because that would be too much definition. The dude doesn't even have feet. So I decided to represent the eye as a screw, as in the case of this completely credible version of the shark here. If you're waiting for next week's free technique, I'm going to show you how to precisely align elements to a bleed inside of Illustrator. Now, I'll explain everything then, but along the way, we're going to create this really cool piece of vector artwork here. Deeks techniques each and every week. Keep watching. In this movie, we're going to take that shark head that we added to the warning sign in the previous movie, and we're going to give it some texture and some depth in order to create a more credible effect like this that looks as if it might actually be part of the sign. I'm going to start by switching back to the image in progress, and the first thing we want to do is add a couple of layer effects to the shark layer. So I'll go ahead and click on the shark layer to make it active, and I'll click on the FX icon and choose Inner Shadow in order to add a shadow effect inside the shark's head. Because after all, we've got this depth inside the cliff and inside this guy up here at the top of the screen and so forth. So assuming your color is black, which it should be, go ahead and crank the opacity value up to 100%. An angle of 130 degrees happens to match the photograph. So I'm going to take the distance value here to 30 pixels, and then I'll take the size value up to 12 pixels. And that's it for the inner shadow. But you can see how it traces along the top of the sharp snout. One of the problems I have with things here is this area right there is lighter, much lighter than the region below it. And the only reason it's not as light, even though it's the same darn cliff inside the shark, is because I scaled it. So I need to lighten up the tip of the shark's nose by adding a gradient overlay. So just click on gradient overlay, and assuming the default settings, that is a black to white gradient with a style of linear and an angle of 90 degrees and a scale value of 100%, the only change you need to make is to switch the blend mode from normal to screen, and then reduce the opacity value to 15% in order to produce this effect here. And we now have this light region up here at the top of the shark's head. Now I'll go ahead and click OK in order to accept that change. And next, I want to add a little bit of texture inside of the sweat that's coming off this guy. And this is going to be a subtle effect indeed, but I think it helps. And I'm going to start things off by marqueing the inside of his body, like so. Then I'll switch to the develop photo layer, which is the photograph itself. And I'll press Control-Alt-J or Command-Option-J on a Mac. And I'll call this layer sweat. And then I'll click OK. Now you want to move this layer to the very top of the stack like so, above the cliff layer. Then Control-Drag or Command-Drag that layer that you just created on top of the little sweat beads. And then finally, press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click the horizontal line between the sweat and cliff layers at the top of the Layers panel in order to clip that texture inside of the sweat. The next thing I want to do is give the shark an eye. But I didn't figure that if this was a real sign, the designers would have drawn in an eye, because after all, the hapless dude that's falling into the shark's mouth not only doesn't have any features, he doesn't have hands or feet. So figure we need to take it easy on the old realism here and just put a screw at that location that would serve as the eye. And I also wanted to replace this screw with the one that actually resides there. I'm going to Alt-click or Option-click on the eye in front of Develop Photo so that I can see the original photograph. And then I'll switch from the rectangular marquee tool to the elliptical marquee, and I'll go ahead and draw an ellipse around this screw. And I'm pressing the Shift key as I do to constrain it to a circle, but you don't have to do that. You just need a lot of room around that screw so that we can apply a layer mask. And now go ahead and scroll up to the top of the sign and shift drag around this region to add it. And if you want to turn this ellipse into a circle as well, release the Shift key and then press it again. And that'll constrain that ellipse to a circle as you add it to the selection. Now click on that photographic layer at the bottom of the stack and press Control-Alt-J or Command-Option-J on a Mac to jump the selections to a new layer. And I'll call this new layer Screws. And then I'll click OK. And now go ahead and turn the other layers back on and drag the Screws layer to the top of the stack. It does not need to be clipped, by the way. If we go ahead and scroll down to the bottom here, you can see the screw that really belongs at this location. If I turn it off, it looks a heck of a lot better than the screw from the other side that is now reflected, and it got enlarged as well, and it has some weird halo around it. I swear this image has not been edited, but it looks like it has. Anyway, we don't want that screw, so let's get rid of it. Click on the cliff layer to make it active, and then go ahead and grab your Spot Healing Brush tool, which is a tool I don't use very often. I prefer the healing brush, but for our purposes, it's going to work out great. You want a big brush that covers the entire screw like this. If I right-click inside the image window, you can see the size is 200 pixels, the hardness is 100% as by default, and the brush is round. Now all we want to do is just click at this location like so, and Photoshop will replace it with something else. It'll just get rid of that screw, which is great. Now let's switch back to the elliptical marquee tool. Turn on the Screws layer, click on the layer to make it active, and now drag around this screw like so. And you can use the space bar in order to move your selection on the fly, so you select that screw as perfectly as possible. And then drop down to the little Add Layer Mask icon and click on it in order to mask everything else away. Now, at this point, it's going to look pretty bad, but it'll look a lot better in just a few moments. Go ahead and zoom out from your image by pressing Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac, and I'm going to zoom out just a click farther. If you Alt-click or Option-click on the layer mask thumbnail, you'll see that everything's masked away except that area that we just selected. But I need a much larger region to be unmasked because, after all, I need to move that top screw onto the shark. So I'm going to press Shift-M in order to switch back to the rectangular marquee tool. And I'm going to marquee a huge region like this here inside the layer mask. And just to check that I've got enough, I'll Alt-click or Option-click on that layer mask thumbnail. I just need to make sure that this region at the top of the shark's face is open, which it kind of isn't. I haven't really selected enough yet. So I'll go ahead and drag this marquee down a little to about there. Then, assuming your foreground color is white and the layer mask thumbnail is still active, you want to press Alt Backspace or Option Delete on the Mac to unmask that area. And now you can click anywhere in the image to deselect it. Let's zoom in on that screw right there. And I'll just go ahead and select this region using the rectangular marquee tool and click on the layer thumbnail itself to make sure it's selected this time around. And then Control drag or Command drag that screw into place. And if you want to get a sense of where it goes, then just press Control semicolon or Command semicolon on the Mac in order to bring back the guides. And you'll see a couple of guides intersect at this location. And just go ahead and center the screw at the intersection of those guides. Then you can press Control D or Command D on the Mac in order to deselect the image. Press Control semicolon or Command semicolon on the Mac to again hide the guides. I'm going to zoom in now and press Shift-M to switch back to the elliptical marquee tool. And I'll marquee this region right there like so. And then switch back to your layer mask here inside the Layers panel. And you want to go up to the Select menu and choose the Inverse command, or you can press Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I on a Mac. Then scroll down to this screw and press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac. And deselect a region like this, a fairly generous region, just to make sure you don't hurt that one. And then what you want to do is confirm that your background color is black as by default, and then press Control Backspace or Command Delete on the Mac in order to leave this screw intact and go ahead and mask this screw as well. And you should get this effect here. Now I'm going to press Control D or Command D on the Mac in order to deselect the image. And we need a shadow for these screws, so drop down to the FX icon and choose Drop Shadow. Make sure that the color is black. Increase the opacity to 100%. The angle should be 130 degrees. And then just take the distance and size values up to 12 pixels like so. My final issue with these effects here is that they're too sharp. Look how extremely sharp those shark teeth are compared with the other elements of this sign. To soften them up, here's what you do. Click on the shark thumbnail itself in order to select the vector shape. In Photoshop CS6, you go up to the Window menu and you choose Properties to bring up the Properties panel. If you're working in an older version of the software, you want the Masks panel. And then increase the feather value here to 1 pixel and then press the Enter key or the Return key on a Mac, and that gives us a little bit of softness. We want even more softness associated with the pixel-based layer mask. So go ahead and click that layer mask thumbnail for the shark layer here inside the Layers panel and change the feather value for it to 2 pixels. And then finally, the mask around the screws is too sharp too. So go ahead and select that top layer mask for the screws layer. And this time around, I came up with a feather value of 1.5 pixels like so. And that just softens things up ever so slightly. And it does so parametrically, meaning that you can change this numerical parameter anytime you like. So you haven't actually permanently modified the layer mask. And that finishes off the effect. I'll press the F key a couple of times in order to switch to the full screen mode. And that's how you use texture and depth to increase the credibility of an element that you've added to a photographic image. Hey gang, this is Deke McClelland. Welcome to Deke's Techniques. This week, we're inside Illustrator, and I'm going to show you how to precisely align your artwork to the bleed because there's no way of doing so automatically. Now, I'll explain what's going on with the bleed in the screencast, but for now, Take a look at this artwork here. The black rectangle represents the outline of the artboard. The red rectangle represents the bleed. As soon as I add a background, notice that everything's out of alignment, especially inside this blue circled area. Now, this would probably work just fine, but you might as well get it right. Here, let me show you exactly how it works. So here's the final version of the artwork with the purple background exactly aligned to the bleed, which appears in red. And by the way, all a bleed is a guideline that ensures that you have more than enough artwork to extend to the very outside edges of a page. I'm going to start off inside this document, which currently has no bleed. To establish a bleed in Illustrator, you go up to the control panel and click on the Document Setup button. And presumably, you want all the bleed values to be linked together, as they are by default. I'm going to go ahead and dial in a bleed value of 0.25 IN. That is a 1/4 inch. And then when I press the Tab key, you can see that all the bleed values change to 18 points because I'm working with points. And that's a value that you want to keep in mind because you'll need to come back to it later. Now click OK, and you can see that the bleed appears in red. Now, ideally, what you would do if you want to align a rectangular background to that bleed is you'd go up to the View menu and you choose Smart Guides, or you'd press Control-U or Command-U on a Mac in order to turn them on. And then you grab the Rectangle tool. And in my case, I'm going to switch to the back layer so that I'm creating the rectangle in the background. And I happen to know that I want the fill to be the shade of purple right here. And I also want the stroke to be none. All right, now I'll drag from this point at which I see the word intersect in the upper left corner of the bleed. And I'll go ahead and drag down until I see the word intersect again in the bottom left corner of the bleed. And then I'll go ahead and release. And I've created a rectangle that's every bit as big as the bleed. However, it's not exactly the right size. If I click on the word transform up here in the control panel, I can see that it measures 648 points wide, which is exactly what it needs to be, but it's 851 points tall. That's only 1 point off, and that's not going to create any problems whatsoever. But let's just say you want a rectangle that's exactly the right size. Well, here's how to achieve that. I'll press Control-U or Command-U on a Mac to turn off the Smart Guides, just so that they don't flash around on screen. And I'll press the Backspace key or the Delete key on a Mac to get rid of the rectangle. First of all, you press Shift-O, which switches you to the Artboard tool. And you can also click on the Artboard tool down here near the bottom of the toolbox. And that'll show you the dimensions of the artboard right here in the control panel on the right-hand side. You can see a width value of 612 points and a height value of 414 points. Go ahead and write those values down and then press the Escape key in order to return to the Rectangle tool. And then just go ahead and click anywhere inside the artwork and dial those values in. So it's 612 points wide by 414 points tall. And then you click the OK button in order to create that rectangle. Now go up to the control panel once again and switch this Align option to Align to Artboard. And then click on any of the horizontal options. Horizontal Align left will work just fine. And then Vertical Align top. But again, you can click on any of the vertical options as well. So click on those two icons in order to align this guy to the artboard. Now we need to align it to the bleed. And we'll do that by clicking on the word transform once again. Click at the end of the width value. And you want to add twice the bleed because we've got a bleed over here on the left-hand side and another bleed on the right-hand side. Our bleeds are 18 points. 18 times 2 is 36. So I'll just go ahead and enter plus 36. And then you want to do the same thing for the height value. Go ahead and tab to it, press the right arrow key in order to advance to the end and enter plus 36 and press the tab key again. Now you have a rectangle that's exactly the right size. It has a width of 648 points and a height of 450 points, which is what we need. And it's exactly aligned to the bleeds, even if you might see a little bit of discrepancy on screen. I'm going to go ahead and lock down that back layer because notice down here these objects that are at various points, not quite aligned to the very outside of the bleed. And that could end up causing us some problems later down the line. So I'm going to press the A key to switch to my wide arrow tool. And I'll go ahead and marquee these bottom points like so in order to select all those bottom edges. And you want to make it a pretty shallow marquee so you don't end up selecting too many points. Let's say we want to line all these guys exactly to the bleed. Then the first step is to once again make sure that Align to Artboard is active up here in the control panel. And then you want to click this guy, vertical align bottom, and that'll align all those points to the bottom of the artboard, which is not what we want. We want the bottom of the bleed, which is 18 points down. So double click on a white arrow tool icon in the toolbox, or you can just press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac. And these are the values you want to dial in. A horizontal value of 0, because we don't want to move the points back and forth. And you want a vertical value of positive 18 in order to move those anchor points 18 points downward. Now go ahead and click OK to accept that change, and we have some precisely aligned artwork, as you can see here. I'll just go ahead and press the F key a couple of times in order to switch to the full screen mode. And I'll press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac so that we can see all of the artwork to the very outer edges of the bleed. Some simple alignment tricks, but I find them to be very useful when I'm creating artwork that includes a bleed inside Illustrator. If you're a member of the lynda.com online training library, I have a follow-up movie in which I show you how to import a pixel-based tracing template into Illustrator. Now, many of you are probably thinking, Deke, that's a really old feature. I already know how to do that. Here's the trick. How do you import the template so that it's the right resolution so that it looks great at the exact zoom ratio at which you want to trace it? For example, I want to trace my artwork at 300%, and I want that pixel-based tracing template to look super smooth so that I can get the best results possible. If you're waiting for next week's free video, I'm going to show you how to draw a distinctive 2D video game character in Illustrator. So much fun. Such a challenge. Deke's Techniques, each and every week. Keep watching.